treasure of the past.
Welcome back. Today we have old story from 1909 about the horrors of the earthquake at Messina city, sleeping when disaster came, crushed in falling homes, dramatic scenes. If you like this content, please tell me your feedback in the comments at the end of the video. The hour was early dawn. Messina, the centre of the greatest disaster of historic times, lay sleeping on that fatal 28th day of December 1908. That faint chill which comes to the semi-tropic lands in the waning hours of a midwinter's night was in the lazy air. The Mediterranean lay like a sea of glass beyond the breakwater. The faint breath of breeze that crept over its waters from the northwest was scarcely sufficient to ruffle its placid surface. Etna's lava-scored but vine-clad slopes darkened the southern horizon, while from its snow-capped peak reared 10,000 feet into the heavens a thin wisp of smoke, gilded by the eternal fires in the death-dealing crater below, floated idly off to the southeast. The hour was dawn, but not a ray of light came from the heavens to banish the foreboding pall that hung like a sable shroud over the doomed city. The wide streets with their myriad of gleaming lights were deserted, save as here and there a belated straggler, muffled to keep out the unwanted chill, hurried to the early mass in some one of the city's majestic churches. In the capacious harbour, scores of vessels swung idly at anchor. The silence was unbroken, save for the muffled tread of the sentries on the ramparts of the citadel, and the lesser fortresses that dotted the waterfront. The city slept, in massive palaces and humble hovels, alike men, women and children, lay wrapped in a slumber from which they were so soon to start in terror, only to be plunged anew into that sleep that knows no waking, tired and worn in body and mind alike by the holiday revels they dreamed on. No foreboding of their impending doom cast its dread shadow over their couches. All nature seemed at rest and at peace. Suddenly out of the skies came a sinister hiss that caused the very priests at the altar to halt in their sacred offices. Heads bowed in prayer were raised as the hiss deepened into an unearthly shriek. The kneeling worshippers leaped to their feet for one brief instant and then slowly and reverently, but with an added touch of terror, again sank to their knees and began to feverishly finger their beads. Crash! Bang! The heavens thundered as from the bursting of 10,000 bombs. The hiss deepened, till it seemed that a myriad of red-hot serpents were writhing in the waters. Then came the whirl, the rush and roar of a torrential rain so terrifying that not a face but blanched with apprehension. Only those who have faced an electrical storm in the tropics can imagine 1/100th part of the horror of that supernatural demonstration. The earth began to pulsate, slowly and in rhythmic measure at first, as though trying its strength, and then with a wild and frenzied burst, like the dance of 1,000,000 imps. It rocked not only Messina, but half of Sicily and all of Calabria, like a raft in a storm. It lasted but an instant, but in that brief span, scores of thousands perished neath the ruins of the stricken city. The first crash from the heavens reached every ear in Messina. The houses had begun to vomit terror-stricken men, women and children before even the fantastic dance of earth began. For well did those who dwelt in the shadow of majestic but death-dealing Etna know what the artillery of the heavens portended. Science may present its theories. Those who dwell in the shadow of death have no use for them. Ages of calamity had taught those men of Messina that earth and heavens act in harmony, and that the rattle of the thunder and the roar of the tempest was but a prelude to a drama of death in which the very earth beneath their feet was to sway like the waves of the sea. Thousands gained the open streets before the final crash came. Walls fell to the right of them. Roofs crashed to the left of them. Cornices and chimneys toppled before them, while death stalked in their wake to destroy any who hesitated or paused. Other countless thousands were too late or were held prisoners of jammed doors and fallen stairways. The earth shook itself in one great convulsive movement, as though the giant whom tradition says Jupiter ages ago imprisoned beneath the massive rocks of Etna was struggling, after centuries of confinement, to break his bonds. Walls shivered, gaped and fell, carrying down to death all who still clung, with convulsive fear, to their racked and ruined homes. Beams groaned and creaked, as if in mortal agony, and then, at the final and supreme moment, slipped from their sockets in the walls. Roofs crashed to earth, carrying down with them the massive arched floors beneath. Even all of those who had sought safety in the streets did not escape. In many of the narrower thoroughfares, the debris piled many feet deep from curb to curb, burying under countless tons of stone and mortar not only those who in their terror had taken shelter in their shadows, but the fleeing hordes who, maddened by the terror of that awful moment, had sought safety in flight. Still other walls, relieved of the burden of roofs and floors, hung tottering, seamed and scarred by the terrible forces of the cataclysm. Crash! The very heavens seemed appalled, and the low-hanging clouds reflected back the sound. Dies Irai! The day of wrath screamed 1,000 throats. The great gas tanks at the northern end of the town had blown up, and before the force of that terrific explosion, the tottering and hesitating masonry crashed prostrate to the dust, burying hundreds of already cut, bruised and battered human beings in the only tomb most of them will ever know. In this crash, the Capucine convent fell, while hundreds perished. Within the churches was to be found the nearest approach to serenity in all that stricken city. The black-frocked priests hesitated but a moment, and then, grasping the sacred hosts in their hands, slowly and with even more than usual reverence resumed their chants till the loosened beams and seamed and gaping walls let tons of death and destruction down upon the flaming altars, burying priests and people alike in the depths of a funeral pyre. The gas lamps flared for the brief instant of the explosion, like the last dying flicker of a candle. Then they went out, leaving the streets in utter darkness. In the horrible wrenching and grinding and twisting of the earth, the electric wires broke, and a million hissing serpents, spitting death, coiled about the panic-stricken survivors. Again the ground trembled, and the earth yawned in hideous fissures that seamed the streets like giant mouths, hungry to devour the panic-stricken and the helpless. The water mains parted, and the reservoirs gushed forth death and devastation. Meanwhile, the cold rain from the north, driven by a wind that had risen to the heights of a hurricane, mercilessly beat upon the helpless and hopeless survivors. Yet, blindly groping in the almost Stygian blackness, to which the dust clouds from the fallen buildings gave added depth, the scarred and stricken survivors plunged onto the open spaces where they felt that safety lay. In the mad panic, few stopped to consider direction, save as it carried them to the broad esplanade that lined the harbour, and away from the Etna of which centuries of peril had ingrained fear into their very beings. Climbing over seemingly impassable barriers of broken stone and twisted and tangled beams, daring death in the shadow of 100 tottering arches, slinking along in the shadows of seamed and scarred masonry. Thousands finally made their way through those acres of desolation and death to the waterfront. In the capacious square that lay open between the great citadel, the railway station, and the massive warehouses and palaces at the southern end of the harbour. Tens of thousands struggled for places as far from menacing walls of masonry as possible. In the smaller square fronting the great cathedral, and in the shadow of its massive walls, other thousands clustered for safety. Proudly and defiantly, the great cathedral had stood the ravages of 2 great fires and countless earthquakes for nearly 1,000 years, ever since the Norman conqueror, away back in the 11th century, had shown to classic Sicily the solemn beauty of the Norman Gothic architecture. So far through all the centuries, it had not failed those who had fled to it for safety. At its high altar alone of all the churches in Messina, the solemn chanting of the Mass was still giving hope in the midst of devastation, destruction, and death. Vain hope. The Grim Reaper had not yet taken his full meed of human sacrifices. The grand old structure, the noblest and most noteworthy in Messina, which had sheltered their forebears through many a siege of destruction, was now, for the first time, to prove unworthy of the trust reposed in it. Already, its scarred walls, weakened by the stress of the centuries, were seamed and cracked by the tumultuous writhings of the earth. Again its foundations trembled, and its massive walls, as though soul-weary after its age-long fight, crumbled to the dust. The university, the almshouse, the municipal hospital, and the custom house already had fallen. The great commercial structures that lined the docks to the south and the palaces that fronted the open sea to the north already were shapeless heaps of stone and mortar, with here and there a wall rising like a grim sentinel guarding a city of the dead. The Trinacria and the Victoria hotels, with their hosts of tourists of all nations, crashed into mounds of ruins over what were in grim truth the graves of hundreds. The Theatre Victor Emmanuel and the Theatre della Munizione, 2 structures of the highest class, were scarred and battered, their roofs fallen in and heaps of mortar defiling the plush and brocade where, but a few hours before, grace and youth and beauty had smiled away their last happy hours. The massive antique columns of the Church of the Annunziata dei Catalani, another grand old Norman structure, tottered and fell, crushed and broken, while the entire facade of the noble structure, wavering for a brief instant, swelled the mass of shapeless fragments. The American consulate, too, fell at the first great shock, burying the consul, Arthur S. Cheney, and his wife. Another American who was killed was Joseph H. Pierce, former U.S. vice consul, who with his family were crushed to death. The entire family was asleep when the first shock came, according to the recital of Miss Evelyn Pierce, a cousin of Mr. Pierce, who was safe at Naples. Mr. Pierce was the first one to realize the terrible shaking as an earthquake. He urged his wife to take the younger children and make her escape. He then rushed into the room where the elder children were sleeping to arouse them. But the tidal wave rushed in and completed the work of destruction. The tottering walls of the Pierce house collapsed, and the entire family was buried beneath the ruins. Mr. Pierce was the Messina correspondent of the Associated Press. Among the buildings wrecked was the barracks of the Carabiniers, in which 50 perished in the ruins. A palace of 26 rooms collapsed, and of the inmates only 4 escaped. The seaward fronts of the University and Palazzo Municipale remain standing, but the interiors are gone. The buildings along the waterside collapsed like houses of cards. The Santelia barracks were destroyed with most of the troops in them. Only 30 soldiers escaping out of 230. The immense military hospital was wrecked, with its sick and convalescents in it. The prison collapsed and buried 400 prisoners, while 30 or more made their escape. Many officers of the garrison later were removed from the ruins still living, but almost all of the guards in the less substantial portions of the building perished. The barracks were demolished. The commander of the troops was killed outright, and there are many victims among the enlisted men. Yet from all this wild carnival of death, thousands escaped to the Avenue Palazzati that skirts the inner shore of the harbour, in a frantic endeavour to escape the hail of bricks and mortar that was still raining death at every tremor upon the refugees. Vain delusion. The story of slaughter was not yet half told. Another, and it might almost be said, even greater calamity was impending. There, in the open places in the rain, bleeding from their wounds, nursing their hurts, the refugees huddled, praying for the coming of the day. Numbed with the horror of the situation, some mumbled prayers, while others, crazed by the shock and the loss of loved ones, danced and sang. The scene was unparalleled in all human experience. Agony was yet to be piled upon their misery. Disaster was yet to come. Death's hideous carnival had but just begun. Agony was yet to be piled upon their misery. Disaster was yet to be piled upon their misfortune. The dreadful forces of nature, having tasted blood, had but had their appetites whetted, and now were about to demand fresh victims. The few soldiers who still clung to the shattered ramparts of the fortresses along the breakwater were the first to give the warning, but it came too late, either for themselves or the hosts who lined the esplanade along the waterfront. In the growing brightness of the dawn, they saw what yet was hidden from those lower down along the water's edge. Rearing its head 50 feet in the air, a giant wave was racing from the Calabrian shore. They did not know, could not know, that already this same wave, first sweeping to the eastward, had engulfed Reggio di Calabria, a city of 50,000 people, 8 miles to the southeast, on the Italian mainland, across the Straits of Messina, and that rebounding from the Calabrian cliffs, it was returning to wreak further vengeance on stricken Messina. Those to the north, beyond the end of the breakwater, saw it almost as soon as the survivors in the forts. In an instant, there was a wild rush for safety, back across those hideous piles of ruins, while the groans of the injured, hopelessly pinioned beneath beam and brick, added to the horror. None then thought of succouring the injured. Self-preservation is nature's first law, and self-preservation was possible only by flight. It seemed but a moment before the hissing wave, speeding along with the fleetness of a racehorse, was upon them. Men, women, and children again had a battle with the most diabolical forces of nature for their very lives. The wave, 50 feet high, rolled back 3 blocks from the shoreline, and in its waters thousands met that death they had so miraculously escaped in the vortex of falling walls and crashing masonry. Hundreds of half-dressed men, women and children who had fled from their houses to the streets were caught in the onrush of waters and drowned or injured. In a moment it had receded, carrying with it many of its unhappy victims, while the bodies of hundreds of others strewed the strand. Flames then began making their way slowly over the devastated area in an inexorable advance. Imprisoned and pinioned human beings, unable to extricate themselves, burned alive. Hundreds were dying of their injuries, while many were starving. The streets were filled with confused masses of brick and mortar, beams, furniture, chimneys and roofs. In many cases the streets appeared as enormous crevasses, twisted into fantastic shapes, The celebrated avenue which runs along the inner seafront from the university to the post office was impassable. All the public monuments that were there had disappeared. All the water pipes, sewers and gas pipes of the city had been destroyed, and water and filth were flooding the torn streets. Gas explosions occurred frequently and resulted in scores of small fires. For several hours after the first destructive shock, Messina was absolutely without organised relief. The municipal officials, the soldiers, the police, doctors and nurses by the hundreds were either buried or drowned. The first work of rescue was performed by volunteers from ships in the harbour and groups of survivors who, at great labour and personal danger, extricated many persons pinioned beneath the wreckage. Messina's crying need was for doctors, clothing, food, and firemen to combat the flames. Doctors, nurses, and firemen were hurried into the wrecked city, but the lack of food and water made the work of rescue difficult. The Russian and British warships at Messina sent crews ashore, and the vessels were transformed into hospitals. All the hospitals in Catania were crowded, and even the schools were converted into infirmaries. The less seriously injured of Messina were dispatched by the dozens to Palermo. Minister of Public Works, Bertolini, arrived and organised several corps of volunteers for rescue work. Refugees telling of their escape relate that, after escaping from their ruined houses, they waited in terror for the coming of light. Then they made their way over the obstructions in the streets to the open places. They had to leave behind them under the ruins countless victims who called for help in heartrending tones. It is asserted that probably half the fatalities occurred because it was impossible for the survivors to render prompt assistance. Not the least of the suffering was caused by the downpour of cold rain. The waters of these straits of Messina were covered with the floating bodies of men and animals and all kinds of wreckage. More than 300 vessels were adrift off Messina alone, while hundreds of others lay on the bottom of the troubled sea. In Messina, crowds of nude persons walked the streets with images of saints. They all appeared demented. From the stricken city, 5 huge columns of smoke could be seen rolling heavenward. All the towns and villages along the straits were rapidly becoming depopulated, as there were widespread fears of further convulsions. Scenes of the weirdest nature were being enacted at Messina and other ruined cities. Clouds of crows and buzzards descended on the stricken district, having crossed the sea in response to some mysterious intuition of the disaster. The roads between Palermo and Messina were filled with long, sad processions of wounded refugees, painfully making their way to the westward. They all believed they were the only survivors. The wife of the French consul at Messina, the sole survivor of her family, finally reached Milazzo. She was badly injured. Her husband, son, and daughter were killed. Ludovico Fucci, a member of the Chamber of Deputies, who was at Messina at the time of the earthquake, gave an account of the death of his brother Niccolò, who was also a deputy, and the efforts to save him, which was absolutely harrowing. From 6 o'clock Monday morning until midnight, he could hear the desperate lamentations of his brother and his anguished appeals for help, without being able to reach him, notwithstanding his frantic efforts. At midnight, the groans gradually died away, and nothing afterward was heard. Many of the wounded died before reaching Palermo, and many have died since they arrived. Most of the refugees were practically naked, some in tattered garments picked up in the streets. The stories related by the survivors in the hospitals and at the food supply stations, where rations were issued twice a day, all reflect the horror of the fateful 28th of December. There were many miraculous escapes, but the cases of bereavement are without number. A cobbler named Francesco Missiano relates that immediately after the first shock, he and his wife and children rushed out into the street. Fires were breaking out all around them. Hearing groans from a pile of debris nearby, the cobbler made a hurried examination. He found 2 girls dying. The head of one was split open, while the chest of the other had been crushed in. The cobbler picked up a baby, but it expired in his arms. It took his party hours to traverse the heaps of ruins between his house and the waterfront. After placing his family in safety, he returned to seek his mother and sisters, but he was obliged to give up the effort. It was impossible to make his way back to his home. During the 36 hours the cobbler passed among the ruins, he did not see more than 5,000 or 6,000 survivors. This man owes his safety to the fact that he lived in a 1-story house. He says that no help arrived for 30 hours after the catastrophe. An old man who had lost all his family was seen going about the ruins, vainly asking for food. He had loaded himself down with his most valuable possessions. While on one of the docks, he suddenly called out, "As nobody helps me, I will die." And with these words he threw himself into the sea. A sailor dragged him out